All right. Hello, everybody. My name is Amalia Weber. I'm the program specialist here at Rochester Hills Public Library, and I'd like to welcome you to this evening's Smart Towns program, A Suitable Helper, Men Who Helped Women Gain the Right to Vote. Before we get started, I'd like to take care of a few housekeeping details. Firstly, tonight's program will be recorded and available to view about 1 week from tonight on our YouTube page and on the RHPL website shortly after. We ask that audience members please silence or turn off their cell phones before we begin in order to avoid any disturbances during the presentation. The Friends of the RHPL 8th Annual Wine, Wit, and Wisdom fundraiser is taking place on Saturday, April 29th. The event takes place here at the library from 6 to 9:30 p.m. Audience members will attend 2 speaker presentations from a choice of 6. The evening also includes a buffet dinner, drinks, including wine, beer, and soft drinks, a silent auction, and a 50-50 raffle. Registration forms are available at the circulation desk, or you can visit rhpl.org/friends for more information. Our next program is The Wide Wide West, Islam, Democracy, and America, which will be an in-person event on Thursday, March 16th at 7 p.m. You can sign up for that at calendar.rhpl.org. And I do apologize for the piano. The doors will be shut. Tonight's program is presented in partnership with Smart Towns, a lifelong learning program for everyone in the community led by education organizations in Rochester, Rochester Hills, and Oakland Township, Michigan. Smart Towns offers lectures, presentations, and courses that introduce the participants to all aspects of the topic and are presented by experts in their fields of study. And now, without further ado, please welcome our presenter, Anne Nichols.
Okay, I saw, not everybody was sure. Is this better? Okay, so greetings from Rochester University. Several of my colleagues are here. I appreciate you guys being out here to support me. I'm actually an English professor at Rochester University, but through the study of 19th century literature, I've gotten interested in historical topics as well. And I was asked to give a presentation for Women's History Month. And this is a topic that I was interested in, so I committed to speaking on the topic to force myself to do a deep dive and to learn so that I could then share with all of you. So thank you so much for being here. It's a truth when we talk about the history of the women's movement that doesn't get a lot of attention, but the only way women could ever get the right to vote is if men voted to give women the right to vote. When we talk about women's suffrage, we tend to highlight the women leaders of the movement, and that's appropriate. I mean, they worked very tirelessly and hard, and it took way longer than it should have. There were literally generations of women who dedicated themselves to the cause. But the idea of male involvement doesn't have to get swept under the rug just to avoid women losing the limelight, right? And it is a topic that is starting to grow in scholarship. Every source I read for this lecture was either a primary historical source from way back in the day, or it was published in 2017 or more recently. So it really is a topic that's just starting to get a little more traction. Tonight's title, A Suitable Helper, I came up with myself. The men who helped women get the vote were actually nicknamed suffragants, which I think is, yes, so clever, right? Because you had your suffragettes, so why not your suffragants? They were also sometimes called mere men, and that was supposed to be derogatory. But I went with a suitable helper because as I was researching this topic, I kept thinking about this verse in Genesis. So after God created the world, the animals, and man, He said, "It is not good for the man to be alone. I will make for him a suitable helper." It used to be that this verse was used, along with the story of the fall in Genesis, to really reinforce traditional gender roles. The idea that man was created to do the work and women was created to be a helper. But that doesn't have to be the case. It could be more of a case of mutuality, with both sexes helping each other. As I was growing up, I went to a lot of weddings where the King James version of this verse was read, and it refers to woman as a suitable helpmeet. My husband's smiling because he knows that when we were engaged, I had one rule, and that was nobody was going to call me a helpmeet at my wedding. And it was because growing up, when I was at these weddings talking about helpmeets, this is what I always pictured. No, thank you. Not appetizing. Not the role I wanted. But back in the 19th century, when women were struggling to get the right to vote, the men in the suits helped. They became suitable helpers. And tonight we're going to talk a little bit more about them. But first, I want to set the stage. Many historians view the Seneca Falls Convention of 1847 as the launch of the women's movement in the United States. That idea is actually under attack right now by historians. It's part of a broader revisioning of history that's going on right now as we're looking at history through, honestly, the lens of race. And you'll find out tonight that Elizabeth Cady Stanton was not always a great friend to African Americans. And I think as a result, her role in history is kind of being diminished. And part of, what I like to talk about is as we grapple with our history, I think it's important not to expect 19th century people to have 21st century values. So she absolutely falls short of 21st century values, but she still accomplished a lot. So when people say, oh, no, Seneca Falls, not that important, they point to people like Thomas Paine, who before he wrote Common Sense, before the Declaration of Independence was penned, he wrote a pamphlet that was called An Occasional Letter on the Female Sex. You also have Mary Wollstonecraft here, who wrote her very famous Vindication of the Rights of Woman in 1792. These texts did a great job of laying a foundation long before America had an organized women's movement, but they focused on conceptual things like education. Mary Wollstonecraft was big on let women learn the same subjects men learn. Don't make it about finishing school, playing the piano, and embroidering. She was big on, hey, ladies, let's take off the corsets. When we're fainting all the time, that's not good for us. So very, very basic, right? Just prior to the Seneca Falls Convention, Margaret Fuller was having her conversations in Boston, and they were also very much about women's role in society at a more conceptual level. So Seneca Falls, here on the far end, we have Elizabeth Cady Stanton presenting at the Seneca Falls Convention in 1847, and then you have Elizabeth Cady Stanton as a tough old bird. All that time, she spent advocating for women's rights, and she still died 18 years before women had the vote. But Seneca Falls was significant for two reasons. One is it was the first time women publicly declared, we want the vote. Second, it really did launch an organized movement. So instead of being standalone and local, that's how it started, but that's not how it ended. It launched a true movement. So I'm going to spend just a minute on Elizabeth Cady Stanton's story. She was actually an abolitionist, which makes current claims that, let's cancel her, she's a bigot, a little more complicated, right? She was an abolitionist even before Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin. That book made being an abolitionist a little more mainstream. It made being an abolitionist, honestly, a middle-class white lady thing to do. But before that, when abolitionists were fringe Quakers, that's when Elizabeth Cady Stanton was an abolitionist. And she married an abolitionist. And in 1840, they got married. And for their honeymoon, they went to London for the World Anti-Slavery Convention. So Elizabeth Cady Stanton, the new bride, rolls up and is greeted with the unpleasant news that in Britain, all the anti-suffrage associations are male only. And she has to spend the first day of the convention in the balcony watching the men debate whether or not to let the American women participate in the convention. The whole first day, they don't even talk about abolition. They just say, what are we going to do about these women from America who showed up? Well, they decide, we're not going to let them participate. So Elizabeth Cady Stanton spent the rest of her honeymoon in the balcony watching her husband talk about slavery and why it should end. And she got very mad. And she spent the time talking with the other women in the balcony about how this isn't right, this isn't fair. And Elizabeth Cady Stanton calls that the birth of the women's movement, because they went back, all those women in the balcony, they went back and they started agitating for women's rights and abolition. And it took her a whole 7 or 8 years, after that convention to launch Seneca Falls. And it started out just like the other events prior. It was a small local event designed to talk about the role of women in society. And Frederick Douglass, our first man of the evening, was one of the few men who attended. He was also the most famous man who attended. And it wasn't until the event was in process and the women were drafting their Declaration of Sentiments, sort of like a Declaration of Independence, right? Here are our demands or our wish list. Somebody said, let's add the right to vote. Elizabeth Cady Stanton loved this idea. Her husband did not. Her husband said, you're just going to make this whole thing ridiculous. He felt like advocating for the vote was just one step too far. It was just ridiculous. And that's how a lot of people at the time felt. But Elizabeth Cady Stanton cornered Frederick Douglass and said, listen, I think if you spoke on behalf of the vote, I think we could get it to pass. I think we could get it added to our Declaration of Sentiments. And he did. So he gave a passionate speech at Seneca Falls about why women deserved the vote. When women passed their Declaration of Sentiments, they included the right to vote, the elective franchise, on their plank. So why would Frederick Douglass have been so interested in the women's movement? Why did he even show up? I mean, it's 1848. We haven't even had abolition yet. So why would he take time out of his abolition activities to go to Seneca Falls? This is the reason he gives us. He says, when I ran away from slavery, it was for myself. When I advocated for emancipation, it was for my people. But when I stood up for the rights of woman, self was out of the question, and I found a little nobility in the act. Okay, so what's interesting is historians hate this quote. Going back to that idea of the revisioning of history, re-looking at it, there's two reasons why people love to hate this quote. One is think about black women and where do they fit. He says, when I advocated for emancipation, it was for my people, black people. When I stood up for the rights of women, self was out of the question, as if my people were out of the question, as if women's rights was a white person thing and he had forgotten about black women. That's one complaint people have. Another is they don't believe him when they say, I found a little nobility in the act. They say, no, man, you knew what you were doing. You knew that women tended to be more abolitionist favor than men, and so if they have the right to vote, they will help you earn your freedom. Maybe his motives weren't pure, but he did the right thing, and I think that's what matters. He has a couple of other quotes. He says, the cause of the slave has been peculiarly women's cause. And he also said, and this one's kind of sweet, I belong to the women. I think we could say he was paying it forward, right? These women had done a lot for him, so he showed up for them. And he did more than just go to Seneca Falls. The year before Seneca Falls, he started his newspaper, the North Star, which was an abolitionist newspaper. But the masthead of every paper had this quote, right is of no sex, truth is of no color, we are all brethren. So this idea of standing up for women was something that he had put on his paper all on his own before Seneca Falls. He advertised Seneca Falls in his paper. He went to Seneca Falls, and then he reported about it in his paper. So he was a great friend to women. And after Seneca Falls, he and Elizabeth Cady Stanton worked very well together for several years. And their cause was universal suffrage. So this idea that free black men and all free women should have the right to vote. Their goal was one constitutional amendment giving all citizens the right to vote. Well, what happened was, as we're in that lead up to the Civil War, the Negro question is what they called it back then, this idea of what is the appropriate role of free black people in society. The Negro question became a very pressing issue, and the woman question, which was what they called the question of what should women's role in society be, got pushed back, and society was much more interested in the Negro question than the woman question. And this is when Elizabeth Cady Stanton had her dark turn, because it made her very mad. And let's see. So the 15th Amendment was passed. That's the one that gave black men the right to vote. It was passed in 1870. So it was passed a full 50 years before women got the right to vote. And that made Elizabeth Cady Stanton very angry. So in terms of what were her motivations when she started this kind of racially charged arguments for women's votes, she had accepted funding from a man named George Francis Train, and his whole reason for funding female suffrage was we need women to vote to counteract the black vote. Again, he seemed to forget that black women existed, right? We need the women to vote to counteract the black vote. Okay. But that was his rationale for funding Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who was working with Susan B. Anthony. They were co-conspirators in the cause. And he gave them funding to publish their own newspaper, The Revolution. The Revolution only lasted for 2 years, but it published some things that should make you squirm. Let's see, what did she say? She said that in being excluded from the vote, women are classed with idiots, lunatics, and Negroes. Frederick Douglass responded to that. He could have just cut her off, started bad-mouthing her in the North Star, but he responded to her directly, and he said, Negroes don't want to be classed with lunatics and idiots any more than our fair sisters. One would have hoped that she would have gotten the message, but she didn't. Her newspaper published an article saying that the country has, this is the quote, elevated the very last and most ignorant and degraded classes of men to the position of master over the very first and most educated and elevated classes of women. So Douglass sent her a letter stating that depicting the black man as an ignorant monster possessing the ballot, that was his quote, is of no real benefit to the cause. And he was so right. If black men are voting, they could vote for you to vote, but you're alienating them. And there's some truth to that. Several years later, in W.E.B. Du Bois was editor of the NAACP's newspaper, which was called The Crisis. The issue of should we support female suffrage was debated. If we support female suffrage, will women use the vote to do things like stop lynchings, or will they not? W.E.B. Du Bois, in responding in an editorial to these questions, said, it's really hard to say. He said, sometimes when people are oppressed, it makes them eager to oppress others because they don't want to be at the bottom of the pecking order. But sometimes people who have experienced injustice are more sympathetic to the injustice of others. So we don't really know how they're going to vote, but let's support them anyway because it's the right thing to do. That was a really nice response. Notice, though, that he's still not really talking about black women voting, right? They're still assuming that the woman voter is a white woman. So, yes, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, I think she did hurt her own cause by making some of these racially charged arguments. And by the time she and Douglass passed away, the women's movement was in what is now nicknamed the doldrums. Early 1900s, the movement had lost a lot of momentum. It was in the doldrums. Anna Howard Shaw was president of the National Women's Suffrage Association, and she reached out to Oswald Garrison Villard and asked if he would speak at a suffragist meeting. He wrote back and he said no. He said, I couldn't possibly commit. But I have an idea, he said, and I hesitate to offer my idea because I have no interest at all in helping with its execution, but here's what I think you should do. He said, I think you need to start a men's league for women's suffrage. I think you need to focus on recruiting wealthy, successful men, and I think you need at least 100 of them before you go public. But if you have 100 wealthy, successful, influential men coming out in favor of female suffrage, I think that's a great thing you could do for the cause. Again, don't involve me. I am not going to recruit for you. That's my idea. Okay, so Anna Howard Shaw was pretty reluctant, but she started talking to the National Women's Suffrage Association. Talk to your husbands, talk to your dads, talk to your brothers. Maybe some of them will help us out. And that is where the majority of the help came from, was men who were drawn to the cause by relationship, wanting to help out the women they cared about. And Anna Howard Shaw's low expectations were exceeded. I mean, not only did the men come forward and lend their name to the cause, they did a lot more than just lend their name to the cause. But we're going to spend the next few minutes on a few exceptions, men who joined not because of the women in their lives. So Max Eastman here became one of the early recruiters for the movement. He was single. He was kind of attractive. The papers started to depict Meerman, the suffragette, as, shall we say, a skirt chaser? These guys, they just want to get close to pretty women. That's the only reason why they're supporting suffrage. Now, I don't think that was really Max Eastman's motivation, but I think he became an easy target for that stereotype because he fit as a young single man. I think he just kind of liked to, did you say disturb the peace? Yes. Yeah, he liked to be a rabble-rouser. He liked to raise a ruckus. He helped recruit the first 150 men. Remember, his goal was 100. He got to 150. That was in 1909. By 1912, he said, and this is his quote, "The suffrage movement was getting too fashionable to appeal to that in me which desires to suffer a little in some high cause." So once it became fashionable, he was out. Other men who came not for the sake of the women in their lives, but for reasons of their own, include Charles Cupp Burlingham. As you can see, he was president of the New York Bar Association. He was, you're reading it, yes? Women ought to try to be more intelligent than they are, if only for the sake of their husbands. Yeah, I don't think he had a happy marriage. His wife was an auntie, meaning she was anti-suffrage, meaning she did not want the right to vote. She was very happy to be a pampered princess. And Charles Cupp Burlingham wanted a little something more. He wanted a suitable helpmeet, you could say. So he believed that enfranchising women would lead to an elevation of female education and intellect. He was referred to as the first gentleman of New York. He was very influential. So having him join the Men's Suffrage League was a major win. Here's an interesting couple. Blanche Bates was a very successful actress. George Creel was her husband. Blanche Bates George Creel, he published his own autobiography, so we actually get a lot more quotes from him than some of these other guys. George Creel describes his wife as a vociferous auntie. She had no interest in women gaining the vote. But he admired her greatly for her career and for her financial independence. She, as a successful actress, was the family breadwinner. This is what he said. my wife and I worked out a financial arrangement. When and if I made enough money to take care of my share of household expenses for the year, the rest of the time would be mine. So when George Creel had, met his quota financially, he liked to devote his time to political causes. And he took on the mantle of suffrage because of a deep conviction that my mother outweighed any man when it comes to brains and character. So he's doing it for his mom, who also had no interest in the right to vote. But she was worthy. She was worthy. He became the Men's League's publicity director, and he was good at it. Later on, he became director of President Wilson's Committee on Public Information. So it's very likely that the good work he did as publicity director for the Men's League helped President Wilson select him for that role. He's an early public relations guru. And he said that he was joining the Men's League because equal suffrage is part and parcel of the great big struggle for equal justice and real democracy. It is as much the man's fight as it is the woman's. So he gets tactical. And so as the publicity director, he gets 10 men to join the committee, and he says, here's the task. I'm going to assign each of you a newspaper, and when that newspaper publishes something anti-suffrage, like a letter to the editor, it's your job to write back. So we're going to make sure that every anti-suffrage opinion piece gets answered. That was his big contribution. So by 1912, 1,000 men marched in the New York suffrage parade. Here we have an advertisement for the Washington, D.C. march that happened the following year. It was patterned off of the success of the New York event. The New York event was successful, so why not do one at the Capitol? And this was the first women's march on Washington. You hear about these still, right? The Women's March on Washington. 1913 was the first one. But before that, you had the 1912 Women's March in New York. And 1912 was a dark time for the women's suffrage movement because of the sinking of the Titanic. Yeah, I know, right? Like, it doesn't seem to follow. The Titanic sunk, and so did women's suffrage. But it was this. This is coming across rather not great resolution. This is a political cartoon from a Cincinnati newspaper. And what you have is the spirit of hypocrisy shouting through a megaphone, women and children first. I'm sure you all know that when the Titanic sunk and there were limited lifeboats, the mantra was women and children first. And the aunties grabbed a hold of this and said, ladies, you can't have it both ways. You can't have the benefits of chivalry and the vote. So feminism was having, or the women's movement, was having a dark day when this 1912 parade happened. And it's interesting what the women did. They had parades in prior years, and the women would ride in cars and ride on horses. But this year, the organizers said, everybody walks. We got to show the world that women can stand on our own 2 feet. We are going to walk the streets of New York, and we're all going to wear white. Weird little tidbit I read while researching this, Macy's was the official retailer. That's where they went for their white. But the men were at the back of the parade. So you can imagine the heckling they received, marching in the back, behind the women. They got heckled. Mere men and suffragettes just is like the little tip of the iceberg of the things that these men were called. And in the men's account of their participation, that's all they can talk about is, oh, the things we were called. But what's interesting is it actually helped the men's league. The men's league at this point had become a national network, right? It had started in New York, but now there's chapters in various cities across the country. And by the end of the year, the national organization had 20,000 members. So it's pretty cool that that heckling actually helped men join the cause. So what you have at this point is fewer people are sitting on the fence about the issue. Most people are defining themselves as either a suffragist or an anti. So fast forward to 1916, and women had won suffrage in 12 states, mostly in the West. Women had helped re-elect Woodrow Wilson, but Wilson then backtracked and said, you know what, suffrage, that's a state issue. I really don't have to involve myself in that. This led, honestly, to a schism in the women's movement because some women said, that's okay. State by state is working. We will stick to it. Others said, no, we must have a national constitutional amendment, and we are going to just get more militant to make it happen. So this is the group led by Alice Paul, the splinter group that's going to be more militant. They became known as the National Women's Suffrage Association. At this point, Elizabeth Cady Stanton is way dead. Her daughter and her granddaughter are both suffragists. And Harriet Stanton Blatch, the daughter, is on Team Alice Paul. Let's do what it takes, right? So they decided to embrace more militant tactics and picket the White House. Today, that doesn't sound so militant, right? Ooh, picketing. But it was the first time someone had picketed the White House. And it was like, what do we do about this? Well, what they did about it was they wrote the women up for obstruction of traffic and threw them in Occoquan Workhouse. This blew up in their face. It turned out to be a huge public relations nightmare. Occoquan Workhouse was notorious for treating people poorly, forced labor, beatings, vermin-infested food. Some of the women went on hunger strikes and they were force-fed, and there was just great media coverage of all of this. So it became a real nightmare for Woodrow Wilson. So he invites Harriet Stanton Blatch to the White House, and he's like, listen, you got to help me figure out what to do about this. And Harriet Stanton Blatch says, well, Mr. President, we need a constitutional amendment. He said, I'd like to do that, but, the southern states. The southern states are just so afraid of giving black women the right to vote. Finally, someone remembered that black women could vote, right? Well, Harriet Stanton Blatch, like her mother before her, is very tactical in her approach. And she says, well, Mr. President, all you need to do is have a census, and then you can show people that the white women voters will outnumber the black women voters, and the South has nothing to be afraid of. And Woodrow Wilson says, well, I actually have that information already, and there's a couple of states that would not be happy with the information. Well, at this point in the conversation, Harriet Stanton Blatch gets very exasperated. And here's her own account. And just picture her looking just like that as she says, I am 60 years old, Mr. President. I have worked all my life for suffrage, and I am determined I will never again stand on the street corners of a great city appealing to every Tom, Dick, and Harry for the right of self-government. When we work for a federal amendment, we are dealing at last with men who understand what we are talking about and can speak to us in our own tongue. We're not asking for an easy way to win the vote. It is not easy to amend the U.S. Constitution. We are asking for a dignified way. And we ought to be able to rely on the chivalry of our representatives to accord to women a self-respecting method of working out their enfranchisement. Well, she didn't exactly convince Woodrow Wilson on that day. But 2 years later, he stood before the Senate and called for the passage of the 19th Amendment. So what caused him to change his mind? Honestly, a lot of it was probably just the tide of public opinion. At that point, 20 states and territories had already legalized women's suffrage. So it wasn't such a fringe movement to be scared of endorsing anymore. If you're curious about Michigan, Michigan gave women the right to vote in 1919. So we squeaked in just ahead of that federal amendment. But when it came to actually ratifying the amendment, we were the third state to do so. When Woodrow Wilson stood before the Senate and called for the passage of the 19th Amendment, he talked about World War I, and he said, "We have made partners of the women in this war. Shall we admit them only to a partnership of sacrifice and suffering and toil, and not to a partnership of privilege and right?" So, Senate, House, sign off. Now we have to get 3/4 of the states to ratify. And the final historical figure I want to talk about tonight is Harry T. Burn. So it all came down to Tennessee. Of course, other states could have eventually ratified, but only one more state was needed. And some of the northern states had kind of surprised everybody by siding with the antis. And Tennessee is getting ready to vote on the federal amendment. So all eyes turn to Tennessee. The state legislature gets to vote. People just come pouring into Tennessee from around the country. And if you were for women's suffrage, you wore a yellow flower. If you were against women's suffrage, you wore a red flower. I brought you all yellow flowers tonight. You better take one on the way out. You don't have the option to choose red. Okay, so Tennessee was in complete deadlock. And Harry T. Burn was the youngest member of the state legislature. He was only 24 years old. And he had consistently said, "I'm undecided on the issue." And he was trying to pull his constituents back home. He had re-election coming up. He wanted to vote in the way that would make him get re-elected. So he said, "I'm undecided." Well, on the day of the vote, he shows up to the courthouse with the red flower. He's decided that voting against will help him the most in his re-election. Right before the vote is called, someone gives him a letter. It's a letter from his mama. Her name is Feb. This is what Feb had to say. "Hurrah and vote for suffrage. Don't keep them in doubt. I noticed some of the speeches against. They were bitter. I have been watching to see where you stand, but have not noticed anything yet. This next sentence is a reference to Harriet Chapman Catt, who was president of one of the major suffrage associations. Don't forget to be a good boy and help Miss Catt put the rat in ratification. Your mother. Well, here's what's interesting. They called for the vote, and he voted against. But it was tied. So they said, we got to vote again. So he voted against. But it was tied. So they voted a third time, and he switched. So he was literally the last man to vote to give women the right to vote. The literal last man. And he put a note in the Tennessee House Journal explaining his flip-flop. He said, I knew that a mother's advice is always safest for a boy to follow, and my mother wanted me to vote for ratification. He was afraid that voting in favor of suffrage would hurt his re-election chances, and honestly, he wasn't wrong. Some of the aunties claimed he must have been bribed. Why else would he have switched his vote like that? Someone must have paid him off. So there was an inquisition, and eventually he was exonerated. He won his re-election campaign by a very slim margin. And then as his life unfolded, he served one term in the state Senate. He had a failed run at becoming governor. He served 18 years on the Tennessee State Planning Commission. He became president of a bank. So he was a successful man, and he had a good life. But never again did he have the national spotlight like that one day in 1920. As we conclude, I hope you found this interesting. But even beyond that, I invite you, I guess I should say, I invite you to consider a few concepts for personal application. And one is just the way we approach history. As I said before, I firmly believe that we need to study our historical figures with an understanding of their culture and their context, and not throw 21st century values on the people of the past. We also need to resist the urge to put our historical heroes so high up on a pedestal that we can't see their flaws. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was a woman of many strong opinions, so some of them were bound to age poorly. A lens of studying history that celebrates the good and critiques the bad seems like common sense, but sometimes our culture struggles with moderation. So the reminder, I hope you don't mind. Second, I hope you find something to be personally inspired by. From Elizabeth Cady Stanton, I personally learn a lot about persistence. 50 years for the suffrage cause. She never saw it happen, but she was able to pass the baton to her daughter and her granddaughter, and they saw it through. So we can learn something about persistence. From the men we studied tonight, I think we can be reminded of our own capabilities to advocate on behalf of the people who have less power than us. Sometimes we need to stand up for those who have less power than us. And that's exactly what men did when they voted to give women the vote. And finally, if nothing else, Harry T. Byrne reminds us that we should listen to our mamas. Thank you very much. So now it's time for questions, if anybody has one. Or comment. It's my mama.
Hey, thank you, honey. I was just wondering your impressions of Frederick Douglass as a person.
They're favorable. Yeah. Very, very interesting man. He had a black wife for many, many years until she died, and then he married a white woman, which back then was just unheard of and illegal. It's fascinating, all the difficult situations he navigated, I think very gracefully. Yeah. You had a question as well? Yes, what happened to Elizabeth Cady Stanton's husband? She never won him over. I can't imagine what that marriage dynamic was like, because she was always going off and traveling on behalf of women's suffrage, which was a cause her husband never supported. They had 7 kids together. I only showed you one, the most famous, but they had 7 kids together. And that annoyed Susan B. Anthony so much. She was like, would you please stop having babies? Susan B. Anthony never married. And Susan B. Anthony was more of the organizer, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton was more of the spokeswoman. So Susan B. Anthony would come babysit and say, I'm not leaving here until you have a speech ready. But I don't think she loved doing it, because she was also like, and please don't have any more babies. Other questions? Yes. Yeah, that's a great question. I'm not actually sure of the answer. You know, these women who had been aunties and said, my place is in the home, did they actually go vote when they had the opportunity, or did they swear it off? That's a really interesting question. Now we call this first wave feminism, because after this major goal was accomplished, there wasn't much of a women's movement until after World War II. In World War II, men went off to war. Women held down the home front. They worked in factories. The men came back, took their jobs back, and the women were like, oh man, I'm a little resentful. And that was the start of second wave feminism. Mr. Carterman.
What impact internationally did the American suffrage movement have?
That is a very good question. I do believe the British beat us to the vote. I'm getting affirmations from some of the wise women of the audience. In many ways, we mirrored them. They got militant before we did. They did the force feedings and the hunger strikes and all of those things before we did. I would assume not. Yeah, that is something I could absolutely learn more about, but I know you're right about race has always been a bigger issue in our country than in Britain. Yeah. Anything else? Yes. Absolutely, yes. All women. It just got forgotten about along the way. Yes.
What pushed Woodrow Wilson over the line to actually support the amendment and have a transition from opposition to support?
I mean, I think how he saved face was by saying he had always personally supported it, but he was trying to carry out the will of the people. That is a great question, too. Yeah, I don't actually know. Now I'm going to go Google that.
Yeah. Well, it just triggered, but I can learn a lot more about that, just as you said a minute ago. But it was Wilson's wife, second wife, who had a stroke in office, and she essentially ran the country. And I believe that might have led to the 25th Amendment, where if a president is unfit, now it goes to the vice president, because I think it went to Wilson's wife.
That's really interesting.
I was wondering if he was the one, because there's that line too that says really she was the first woman president, because she just did it under the background where nobody knew she was the one signing it first.
That's interesting. Yeah, I told you guys at the beginning, I'm really a literature professor. I came to history through literature. So that's why sometimes the answer is, I don't know. But I love the questions. It makes me want to learn more. Thank you so much for being here tonight, everybody. You've been a great crowd. I've appreciated it.